Greetings, dear viewers, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to AddisDialogue. Today on the show, we will be talking about the port deal signed between Ethiopia and Somaliland and the various implications. And I'm so honored to have on the show Ambassador J. Peter Pham. He's a former U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel and Great Lakes regions of Africa, distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council and a senior advisor at the Crack Institute for Tech Diplomacy. He will help us put into perspectives the various angles and implications of the port deal. With the program, I'm Shfarad. Ambassador, many thanks for making the time to talk to us.
Well, thank you for having me.
As you know, sir, there have been various assumptions, presuppositions, and lots of guesses, if you will, circulating around the port deal between Ethiopia and Somaliland. And you've recently written a great article clarifying the realities on the ground. So if we could just start from the article dubbed Washington's One Somalia Delusion, sir, you eloquently dwelt on the huge benefits the deal between Ethiopia and Somaliland would have, not just for the two in question, but for others, including Somalia and even Egypt. This being as it is, you raised the question as to why the current U.S. administration is voicing concern over the deal. So, Ambassador, how should the U.S. administration approach the port deal between Ethiopia and Somaliland while respecting the realities on the ground in the Horn of Africa?
Well, thank you for this opportunity. My starting point always in international relations is to begin with reality. We have to deal with the world as we find it, not as we might wish it to be or imagine it to be, but what we have. And let me, if you'll permit me, just to review for the sake of your audience and anyone else, some key facts.
Yes, sir.
First, the reality is that Ethiopia is the world's largest and most populous country that is landlocked. You're talking about more than 110 million people, over 1 million square kilometers without access to the sea. And so it's right and natural, as well as within its legal rights, for Ethiopia to pursue access to the sea as a top priority for its economic stability, its strategic and defense possibilities, and its general this geopolitical balance of the entire region. It's absolutely essential for Ethiopia to have an access to the sea. Currently, its access to the sea, as we all know, comes primarily through Djibouti, and that comes at an enormous cost. Last year, estimates are that Ethiopia had to pay over $1.5 billion US just to have access to the sea through the one port of Djibouti, which can be very congested. Okay, that's reality one. Ethiopia's needs and its right to access to the sea as enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which states that landlocked countries do have a right to access the oceans of the world. The other reality we have to deal with is the reality of what was once a United Republic of Somalia, which is now broken into Somaliland, which for 3 decades now, more than 3 decades, has been essentially, and for all intents and purposes, independent, operating on its own, having reclaimed the sovereignty and independence that it had before, one should recall, before the Italian former colony of Somalia was independent, reclaimed its borders and independence, and effectively been now on its own longer than it was part of the unhappy cohabitation with Italian Somalia. And then you have the disorder that is occurring and has been occurring in south central Somalia since the collapse of the Siad Barre dictatorship in 1990, 1991. Instability, which unfortunately we witnessed just recently with the attack by the Al-Shabaab terrorists in the middle of Mogadishu near the presidential compound. Disorder which we see in piracy, 21 incidents since November from Somalia out into as far as the middle of the Indian Ocean. So that's a reality we also have to deal with, that Ethiopia has to work with partners that exist, partners that are effective, and which can ensure its national right to access the sea. And the memorandum of understanding, of course, obviously, the final agreement has to be negotiated between Ethiopia and Somaliland and their governments. But, and we have to reserve judgment until then. But the basic outlines in the MOU signed by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Somaliland President Musa Bihi lays out what seems to be an equitable deal between the two governments to enable Ethiopia to access the sea, but also enable Somaliland to continue to develop its port infrastructure and gain and diversify its economic base.
Beautifully put, Ambassador. Beautifully put. As you know, Ethiopia's economy, coupled with its growing population, have been some of the driving factors pushing this East African nation to look for diversified options to have access to sea outlets with Somaliland, which was a former British protectorate and gained its independence before the former Somali Italiana. Now Somalia is finding it difficult to accept this and is crying foul whenever it gets the platform. As you know, Egypt is also a strong supporter here. If we really read between the lines, Ambassador, what's the lurking agenda behind being driven here?
Well, I think, in all honesty, the rivalry, and it's an unnecessary conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt over the building of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and Egypt's fears. That rivalry is well known to everyone. So if there's an opportunity to take Ethiopia down a notch or two, our Egyptian friends will seize it happily. It's unfortunate because, as we know, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is not built to keep water. It's a hydro dam. Water must flow. I think we all know why there are fears, because Egypt has been using more than its fair share of the waters for decades now. But that's a separate issue, and we can have a whole conversation about that. But with Somalia, I think it's a distraction from their own inadequacies. The fact is the government cannot even control and secure its capital of Mogadishu. The fact, as the chief of the Ethiopian National Defense Force rather candidly put very recently, 60% of the former Somalia Italiana's territory is secured by the presence of Ethiopian National Defense Forces there, helping them. They couldn't do it on their own. So they can't even secure national territory. So there's a lot of angst in it. They project. They've not exercised any sort of control or authority over Somaliland since 1991. So there's a lot of angst, a lot of drama, but it distracts from the fact that they haven't dealt with issues at home. And I think that that's what they're trying for, is to avoid having to deal with the issues closer at home.
Also, Ambassador, considering its heavy reliance on Djibouti, what are Ethiopia's implications of diversifying its maritime options? And how will it diversify Ethiopian bottlenecks in Djibouti, where everything has to come through, as you know, at very high prices?
Yeah, the additional cost is a burden to the Ethiopian economy. That's undoubtedly, the estimate is that just in port payments alone, not increased prices because of the bottleneck, but just in port fees alone, Ethiopia is paying over $1.5 billion US a year to Djibouti. Now, it's a windfall for Djibouti, but certainly a burden to the Ethiopian economy. Then you add the additional cost of lack of competition and sole source and a bottleneck, and that's all a burden, which makes it more difficult to have business opportunities, which constrain economic growth for a growing population. All things that, by diversifying, it enables Ethiopia to have greater opportunities, not only for faster access to the sea for certain parts of the country, but also to lower prices and an opportunity to build up the economy. And it's not just Ethiopia's economy we're talking about. The port at Berbera, which, by the way, was built by DP World, which is in the United Arab Emirates base, and which has, among investors, the former protectorate power, the United Kingdom, is directly invested in the expansion of that port. So there are international partners here at work as well that are also involved. But increasing and building up the port at Berbera allows Somaliland to benefit as well. One expects that by within the decade, 53,000 jobs will be created that wouldn't exist but for the economy growing out of the port. And one expects that the estimates are, even the conservative estimates, that the growth in trade with Ethiopia and other parts of the region will add another 6 or 7 points to the GDP of Somaliland. So Somaliland benefits from this as well. And certainly the entire region and the world benefits from having Berbera, which is the finest deep water port between Suez and South Africa, having an additional diversification, especially when one sees what recent events and what the Iran-backed Houthis are doing in the waters off of Yemen, just across the Gulf of Aden. So again, it's greater security for the global supply chains as well.
Moving on from there, Ambassador, what diplomatic strategies should Ethiopia employ to address the concerns that Somalia is raising now and for other regional actors while pursuing this strategic interest and naval presence in the Red Sea, sir?
Well, I think, from conversations I've had with diplomatic contacts across the region, it's quite clear that it's a lie that Ethiopia did this unilaterally without prior consultation. It's clear that Ethiopia did consult widely throughout the region, and its diplomatic corps engaged with the neighbors. I think some of them may not have liked the answers they received, but there was engagement. Let's put that to rest. Secondly, I think Ethiopia needs to continue to make the case to the international community that, one, this deal is in conformity first and foremost with reality, political and security realities on the ground. Secondly, everyone stands to benefit from this. Certainly the people of Ethiopia, people of Somaliland first and foremost, but also everyone in the region benefits from an Ethiopia and a Somaliland that are more stable, more economically vibrant, more integrated, and they all can benefit from this infrastructure. It's not just infrastructure for the benefit of import and exports from Ethiopia and Somaliland, but others can, the market is open, and the warehousing and transshipment opportunities at the port of Berbera really help connect the region as a whole. But I think the economic benefits need to be perhaps the case better made or made more consistently, but also the security benefits. 53,000 jobs created in Somaliland means 53,000 young men and women who aren't distracted, perhaps looking, and susceptible to malign actors influencing them because they're gainfully employed and see a horizon of hope and opportunity for themselves. So whereas a Somaliland that isn't economically viable or is challenged economically certainly presents a far greater risk to the region.
Also, as you know, Ethiopia wants to have this naval presence in the Red Sea, and there are different actors, countries that are strongly against it. What is wrong with Ethiopia having a naval presence in the Red Sea?
Well, certainly there are those who would prefer to keep Ethiopia down, but Ethiopia has a right to secure not only access to the sea, but also to be able to protect that access. It won't do anyone any good to have access to the sea and then face piracy. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, piracy is on the uptake. And where is it coming from? From the territory of the former Somalia Italiana, where they've been unable to control their territory and have permitted piracy, 21 incidents since November alone. Now, up until 2022, the United Nations Security Council had allowed other countries to operate within the territorial waters of Somalia because Somalia was clearly unable, we recall the great piracy epidemic a decade ago, to control its waters. But this was an example of wishful thinking. Then 2022, all of a sudden, magically, this regime in Mogadishu, which had up to then had been unable to control, would somehow magically step in. We have the proof now in these increasing attacks at a moment when we already have problems of navigation in these waters because of the Houthi attacks on the other side of the Gulf of Aden and in the Red Sea. We have piracy growing up. It's quite clear that the government in Mogadishu, the regime there, is incapable of controlling its territorial sea, much less territory. So, if Ethiopia is to have meaningful access to the sea, it has to be able to protect shipping coming in its direction. It's uniquely vulnerable. And the deal that was laid out in the memorandum signed by Prime Minister Abiy and President Musa Bihi lays out an interesting deal. Ethiopia leases part of the coastline of Somaliland, a small strip of it. It's a very long coastline, more than 700 kilometers. We're talking about 20 kilometers, to have a naval presence. In exchange, Somaliland acquires equity stake in one of Africa's largest and most vibrant airline networks, that of Ethiopian Airlines, and it diversifies its portfolio and its income stream. So it's a win-win deal.
However, Somalia, sees this as a breach of territorial sovereignty, and also there are some who say the deal could destabilize the entire region. On the flip side of the coin, however, there are people that assert that this deal could help stabilize the volatile region. So what's your stance here, Ambassador?
My stance is very, very clear and unambiguous. Somaliland was independent before Somalia was independent. Even the African Union Commission twice has stated that the case of Somaliland is unique in African history and is a separate matter from the usual stance of not breaking up states, because Somaliland did become independent within its borders. It's a unique case. Secondly, the unique history that occurred and the fact that it has been effectively separated from Somalia for longer than it was united makes it a unique case. Somalia cannot claim to a breach of sovereignty that it has not been able to exercise in more than a generation. It's a fictional. It's almost as if former ruling houses claiming sovereignty that has been passed, that has gone with revolutions decades or centuries ago. It's fictional. Its sovereignty and authority must be effective. It hasn't been. And as for the destabilization argument, I would argue that that's a red herring. What will destabilize the region is Ethiopia being constrained in growing prosperity for its growing population, Somaliland losing an opportunity to develop its port infrastructure, create jobs for young people. That will destabilize far more than some speculative argument over whether the loss of sovereignty that hasn't been exercised for more than 30 years would do to Somalia.
My final question would be, what's the way forward for Ethiopia and for Somaliland and for the entire Horn of Africa?
I think the way forward, first and foremost, is the negotiations need to be concluded between the government of Ethiopia and the government of Somaliland for the final agreement, and then it begins to be implemented. The key thing now is finish the agreements, finalize them, and move forward to rapid implementation.
Absolutely. Ambassador J. Peter Pham, former U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel and Great Lakes regions of Africa, distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council and the senior advisor at the Crack Institute for Tech Diplomacy. Thank you so much, sir, for your ideas and for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you for having been with us so far. Until I see you next time with another program, it's a bye-bye from me.